Openness is the one we're going to concentrate on most particularly today. And it's openness to experience technically, and it seems to break down into intellect and openness proper, which is it's intellect, which is interest in ideas, maybe facility with ideas, and openness, which is more like creativity. That's now you can't divide them into interest in ideas and creativity so precisely because they overlap to a great degree. Women are about a third of a standard deviation higher than men in openness/creativity, and men are about a third of a standard deviation higher than women in interest in ideas and intellect. And that's actually quite a substantial difference within a trait that's when the two traits are so highly correlated. So there's reason to do the fractionation. So anyways, so we're going to concentrate on openness today, and the reason that I'm presenting the trait description first rather than moving immediately into, say, IQ and creativity is because it's useful to know that you can take intelligence and put it in the big five taxonomy. And you can actually measure intelligence a lot more accurately with an IQ test, and perhaps also with a creativity test, than you can with a self-report personality test that relies on adjectives. Anyways, we're going to concentrate on openness today. And we're going to concentrate both on creativity and intelligence. And there's actually almost nothing in psychology that's more contentious, generally speaking, than the investigations into the technical or the set of skills and abilities that falls under trait openness. And the reason for that, and this is especially the case with intelligence, is that intelligence is actually quite measurable. We've been able to measure it since roughly the beginning of the 20th century. Binet originated the first, I would say, reliable and valid IQ tests, and they've been used quite extensively for a long period of time. And IQ, I'll tell you what IQ is as we go through this, but there isn't anything that social scientists have been able to measure more successfully than IQ. And there's nothing that or very little. There's one exception. The relationship between income inequality and male homicide is a more powerful relationship than the relationship between IQ, say, and general life success, or IQ and general school success. It's even a little stronger than the relationship between IQ and the rate at which you learn something new. But other than that, it's pretty slim pickings. And so we're going to walk through very carefully how IQ tests are created and formulated, and exactly what it is that they measure and why. And we'll equate that to some degree to creativity, and also differentiate it from creativity as well, making the assumption that the aspects of openness, intellect and openness proper, are the proper aspects, and that they're usefully differentiated. So the first thing that you might want to consider is that the world is a very complicated place. Now, we've talked about this before. And the way that you handle, there's way too much complexity for you to handle in its entirety. So for example, in a room like this, there's an endless number of phenomena that you could focus your attention on, right? From the sort of macro phenomena, which would be the overall, say, color or appearance of the room, to the micro phenomena, which would be the details at the highest level of detail that you're able to perceive that litter the landscape anywhere. And so one of the problems that you have to solve when you're operating in the world is how you perceive the world. And we do that in part by making, I would say that we perceive low resolution representations of the world, and we also confuse those with the world. So when I'm looking at you, I'm really looking at what I perceive consciously is a low resolution representation of you, right? So okay, so then the question might be, well, if intelligence has to solve the problem of how to perceive and navigate within the world towards ends, in order to fulfill, in order to make the world manifest what it needs to manifest so that you can maintain yourself and stay alive, what ends is it orienting itself towards? And I think that's a good way of thinking about the traits. The traits motivate the perceptual frame. And so you might think that, well, extroverted people are after social success. And you can understand why that would be, because social success brings with it all sorts of rewards. Social failure brings costs, and you could also understand why that would frighten you away from it. And social success also requires the expenditure of effort, and introverted people seem to be much more conservative in a sense in terms of expending energy socially, and I suppose they're protecting themselves to some degree against the possibility of social failure. We don't really know. We know more about how extroverts, in some sense, how and why extroverts orient themselves the way they do in the world. We're not so sure about introverts. What it is that, what the proper landscape is for introverts. I can show you a word cloud. I'll do that at some point, that were generated from introverts on Facebook. And they seem to be into fantasy and gaming a lot. And I don't know why that is exactly, because the fantasy element should be more localized in openness. But the introverted types, I mean, I suppose they're the people that are on the Big Bang Theory. You know, they seem to be the introverted types. And but we don't understand that much about them, exactly how it is that they're orienting themselves in the world. People who are high in neuroticism are oriented towards security and safety. Agreeable people versus disagreeable people are oriented, say, towards cooperation versus competition. Conscientious people are oriented towards order, duty, obligation, and implementation. And open people are oriented towards abstraction, in both ideational and in representation. And so those are also, to some degree, you might also think about those as value systems, right? Because what you value is definitely not only what you pursue. That's too narrow a view. Value is also what you perceive and pursue. And so thinking about these things as this entire frame of reference, I think, is a much better way of doing it. We talked about this earlier, this sort of structure earlier, as a micro-personality. And I mentioned the determination of micro-personalities by fundamental underlying biological systems like defensive aggression and sexual desire and hunger and thirst and so forth. Those are all systems that can grab your perceptions, make you look at the world in a certain way, make you pursue something else in a certain way, and prime action responses that are in keeping with all of that. The traits seem to be something like higher order agglomerations of those more fundamental biological motivations. Although we don't quite understand the relationship between the underlying biology and the traits, we're starting to sort it out. So we know, for example, if you look at the function of the hypothalamus regulates the basic biological motivations that I just outlined, but it's also the place where the exploratory systems find their ultimate physiological grounding, and openness and extroversion seem to be variant manifestations of the exploratory impulse, and that's grounded in the hypothalamus. You know, sometimes in a dangerous social environment, it's not obvious that being an extroverted person is a good idea, because extroverted people, they stand out, especially if they're extroverted and creative, right? Because not only are they noisy and dominant and assertive, they're also colorful and flamboyant and provocative. Well, that's great if you're in a society that rewards that sort of thing, but if you have, you know, if you're ruled by an authoritarian king who wants absolutely no threat whatsoever to his stability ever, then dressing in gray and shutting the hell up is a really good survival tactic. So the utility of the trait depends on the structure of the environment that surrounds it. And that's why there's variability in traits. And so you have to be careful when you're thinking about it from a strict scientific perspective to make the assumption that positioning at any place on the normal distribution is preferable to positioning anywhere else. Now, one exception to that might be IQ. Because one of the things that you can see with IQ is that people with higher IQs seem to do better, but that's also only true in complex societies. And then there's another problem that seems to emerge with IQ, and I don't know exactly what to make of this, but we know that as women's IQ increases, the probability that they're going to remain without a mate also increases, because women tend to mate across or up dominance hierarchies. And so if you're a woman with an IQ of 130, then you've already eliminated about 95% of the men. And that's only using one criteria. That's just straight intelligence. And so there also might be limitations to the utility of intelligence with regards to reproduction that we don't really understand very well yet. So anyway, so you get the point. So Popper's idea was that the reason that we developed the capacity to abstract was so that our stupid ideas could die instead of us. And that's really, it's almost impossible to overstate how brilliant an observation that is. Because what it means is that, like, as a standard animal, you would have to produce variants of yourself reproductively to go out into the world and try their hand at survival. And that's pretty costly because you have to produce all the biological replications of you, so you could only probably manage that maybe 13 times if you really, really worked at it. And then the cost of their failure is extraordinarily high because they die. Well, you can just sit there and produce like 20 different versions of you extending out over the next week or the next month, and you can run them through a simulation and kill off all the ones that you don't regard as suitable and then only implement the successful ones. Now, you know, you could debate about how accurate you might be at doing that because it would depend on your knowledge, but we do know that intelligent people tend to do better across the course of their life. And so it does seem that there is some utility with regards to survival, or at least with regards to positioning in the dominance hierarchy, which is somewhat of a proxy for survival and for reproductive success. There's some association between that and the ability to abstract. And so then you can see how, if you think about preference for fiction, which is actually part of openness, preference for fiction, the utility in fiction is that it allows you to experience a plethora of simulated worlds and to embody the consequences in abstraction without having to go through the trouble of doing that for yourself. And we do know there's good empirical literature now showing, some of it done by ex-students from my lab, showing that reading fiction does improve your interpersonal intelligence, for example, your ability to understand the position of other people, logically enough, because that's what you're doing when you're reading. So as men get trickier, women get trickier to understand them, and then as women get trickier to understand, men get trickier to understand them. And so we've been chasing each other around this cortical expansion loop pretty much since we parted ways with the ancestor that we had in common with chimpanzees. And so that's roughly about 7 million years ago. We've undergone a tremendous cortical expansion since then.